He was the man who made the world fall in love with Australia. With a grin that could cut through the desert sun and a knife that could make any Hollywood hero step aside, Paul Hogan became an international icon. Crocodile Dundee didn't just make him rich, it made him immortal. The film shattered records, earning more than $328 million worldwide, turning a bridge worker into one of the most recognizable stars on Earth. But behind the jokes and the swagger was a man quietly fighting battles that money, fame, and even laughter couldn't fix. Because by 2015, the same man who'd once held the world in his hand had just $50,000 left in the bank. His body was failing, his career was fading, and his government had turned against him. For 7 long years, the Australian tax office barred him from leaving America. He missed weddings, funerals, even his own mother's. And when the accusations finally lifted, the damage was already done. His reputation was shattered. His friends had drifted away, and his health, once as tough as the outback, began to crumble. In 2022, doctors discovered something inside him, something that would change everything again. Hogan had developed a mysterious condition that stopped his body from absorbing nutrients. No matter what he ate, he couldn't gain weight. The once strong, sunburned figure who'd wrangled crocodiles now struggled to open pill bottles. He'd lost nearly 30 pounds, his energy gone, his muscles thinned. "I'm not in great shape," he admitted. "I'm just old and fragile." Those words hit hard because they didn't sound like Mick Dundee. They sounded like a man who'd seen too much, lost too much, and was ready to tell the truth. But to understand how the wildest star in Australian history ended up so far from home, you have to go back, long before the fame, before the movies, before the knife, to a boy from the dust. Paul Hogan was born on October 8, 1939, in Lightning Ridge, New South Wales, a place that barely existed on the map. It was the kind of town where men disappeared into the earth and sometimes never came back. Opal miners dug deep shafts under the sun that scorched the land to 110 degrees, gambling everything on the promise of a stone that might never appear. The streets weren't paved. They were red dirt, dust storms, and heat waves. The town barely had 2,000 people, but it had twice as many stories. Guns, drinking, and sudden fights were part of the daily rhythm. Out there, you learned early that toughness wasn't a choice. It was survival. Paul's father, Jack Hogan, had come back from the war with discipline burned into his bones. He worked as a canteen store manager, steady but strict. His mother, Florence, stayed home with their 6 children, holding the family together with what little they had. The Hogans were poor, even by outback standards, but their world was full of noise, chaos, and love. In that little mining town, Paul learned how to make people laugh, not because he wanted attention, but because it kept the peace. His father's temper was quick, and laughter became his armor. He'd do impressions of local miners, twist Aussie slang into jokes, and mimic radio comedians like Roy Renee until his brothers cried laughing. But childhood in Lightning Ridge didn't last long. By the time Paul was 9, opal mining had dried up. There was no money left in the dirt, and the Hogans packed up what little they owned and moved east, settling in Granville, a cramped working-class suburb of Sydney. The shift was brutal. Gone were the endless horizons and open skies. Instead, Paul found himself in a 2-bedroom house with 6 siblings and a war pension that barely covered rent. The neighborhood was full of factory workers and ex-soldiers trying to rebuild their lives after the war. The air smelled like metal, sweat, and survival. Paul enrolled in Parramatta Marist High School, a Catholic school where discipline ruled harder than compassion. Rulers were weapons. Punishments were public. The priests didn't care about humor, only obedience. But even in that harsh environment, Hogan's spark stood out. He'd pull stunts, make up ridiculous creatures like drop bears and hoop snakes, and tell tall tales so convincing that even teachers believed him. Soon, classmates were paying him 3p just to tell another story. He wasn't just funny, and he had charisma, the kind of magnetism that made people want to listen. Still, school wasn't built for kids like him. By the time he turned 15, reality came knocking. His father's pension wasn't enough to feed the family, and dropping out of school wasn't rebellion. It was necessity. Like 1 in 4 teenagers at the time, Paul left the classroom and went straight to work. His first job was on construction sites, lifting steel beams and shoveling gravel for long, brutal hours. It was 1954, and Australia was still rebuilding. The pay was terrible, the days endless, but the camaraderie was something else. Workers swapped stories like currency, and humor was the only thing that kept them sane. In those cold nights, sitting around old stoves in the boarding houses, Paul became the entertainer again. His jokes weren't fancy, but they were sharp, drawn from the rough lives around him. At home, things weren't easier. His father ruled like a sergeant, his patients often drowned by exhaustion. Paul learned that humor could diffuse tension faster than anger. He used laughter to keep his family from falling apart, performing sketches in their living room for neighbors who paid in coins and smiles. That little audience didn't know it, but they were watching the birth of a performer. Somewhere between the dust, the discipline, and the laughter, a dream was forming, though Paul didn't even know it yet. But fate wasn't done testing him. One summer, his family returned to Lightning Ridge for a visit. The outback was hotter than ever, a shimmering wasteland of red dust and danger. Paul wandered off, exploring the old mining fields where hundreds of open shafts lay scattered across the land. Hours passed. No one could find him. The temperature climbed past 110 degrees and the air shimmered with heat. Those mines weren't just holes. Some were filled with gas, others deep enough to swallow a man whole. For 6 hours, young Paul was lost in the desert, surrounded by silence, snakes, and the endless hum of heat. When they finally found him at sunset, he was dehydrated, blistered, barely standing, but alive. That day stayed with him forever. Years later, he said that was the day the outback got into his bones. It became part of who he was, wild, tough, and quietly unbreakable. As he grew older, that toughness blended with something else. Charm. He developed the gift of talking his way out of trouble and into opportunity. But it wasn't glamour, not yet. In Granville, most kids ended up in factories or construction, and Paul was no different. He bounced from job to job, taking whatever work paid enough to keep him afloat. He never forgot the feeling of being poor, or the humiliation of being told he'd never amount to anything. It was fuel, the kind of fire that doesn't fade easily. At 19, he landed a job that would define the next decade of his life, working as a rigger on the Sydney Harbor Bridge. The work was deadly. No harnesses, no safety nets, just raw steel and open air. Every day was a gamble with gravity, rain, and wind. 16 men had already died building that bridge, and Paul knew the risks. But he loved it, the danger, the view, the freedom. "You couldn't be afraid of heights," he once said. "If you were, you just didn't last long." What he didn't know then was that the same bridge that nearly killed men would one day make him famous. But fame was still years away, and first, he had to learn that even laughter couldn't save him from heartbreak. Life on the Sydney Harbor Bridge wasn't for the faint of heart. The men who worked up there called themselves riggers, but really they were daredevils, crawling along steel beams hundreds of feet above the city with no ropes, no harnesses, and no second chances. Paul Hogan thrived in that chaos. He had the strength, the balance, and more importantly, the courage to laugh at fear. It was there, hanging above the harbor in the roaring wind, that he found the rhythm of his humor. Quick, dry, and fearless. Every day could have been his last, and that kind of danger sharpens a man's wit. He joked his way through the terror, keeping his crewmates laughing even when they were inches from disaster. That laughter, as strange as it sounds, kept them alive. But working on the bridge was only part of Hogan's double life. At night, he poured beers in rough Sydney pubs, and that's where his comedy sharpened into something electric. The crowds were brutal, half-drunk, and always ready to heckle, but Hogan never backed down. He roasted everyone, their jobs, their accents, their clothes, and somehow made them laugh at themselves. One night, though, he went too far. A joke about a man's wife turned the room from laughter to rage, and within seconds the place exploded into a fight. Bottles smashed, chairs flew, and Hogan barely made it out the back door. That night changed him. He learned that comedy wasn't just about jokes. It was about timing, empathy, and knowing when to stop. It was a lesson he'd carry into the spotlight years later. By 1958, Paul Hogan was 19 and already a husband. He met Noeline Edwards at a local dance, and they fell in love fast. There wasn't money or even much of a plan, but there was warmth and youth and a shared dream of something better. They married, and before long they had 3 sons. But happiness was expensive, and the bills never stopped coming. Hogan worked brutal hours as a rigger by day and hustled whatever side jobs he could find at night. Painting, bartending, even smuggling small bags of opal dirt from Lightning Ridge to sell the gems he found inside. It was dangerous, illegal, and desperate, but he had mouths to feed. He once said, "If I'd been caught, I would have gone to jail. But I was broke." You do what you have to do. The years rolled by in sweat and exhaustion. The marriage cracked under the strain, patched itself back together, and cracked again. They separated, reconciled, and finally divorced in 1981, only to remarry a year later. Then in 1989, they divorced again for good. Their story was one of love and chaos, and the public would one day watch it all unfold in headlines. But long before that, Hogan was still unknown, just a worker on the bridge, with no reason to think his life was about to change forever. It happened by accident. In 1968, while Hogan was eating lunch on the bridge with his crew, a television crew showed up to film a safety PSA. Hogan started cracking jokes about the workers' hard hats, about the rules, about everything they were trying to shoot. The producers couldn't stop laughing. His natural timing, his cheeky smile, the way he poked fun at authority, it was pure gold. By the end of that day, they offered him a small part in a union advertisement. Those ads went to air, and something incredible happened. People loved him. His face, his voice, his humor, it was all instantly familiar. He wasn't an actor trying to be funny. He was a regular bloke who just was funny. The commercials caught the attention of television executives at Channel 7 who offered him more work. Within months, Paul Hogan had made more money from those ads than he did in an entire year on the bridge. But it wasn't just about money. It was about possibility. For the first time, he saw a glimpse of something bigger, a life beyond hard hats and high steel. Still, fame didn't come easy. He was an untrained comedian, an outsider with no connections, and he had to fight for every chance he got. In 1970, he appeared on Tonight with Al Fisher, a popular Australian talk show. He was supposed to play it straight, answer a few questions, smile, and go home. But Hogan didn't do straight. He threw out the script and improvised a wild outback survival routine full of slang, wit, and pure Aussie humor. The audience erupted. The phone lines jammed. The studio had never seen a reaction like it. Overnight, Hogan became a national sensation. His fee jumped from $50 to $500 in a week. Networks began fighting over him. He'd gone from a bridge worker to a celebrity, almost by accident. But his rise wasn't without bumps. In 1971, during the filming of a cigarette commercial, disaster struck. A stand-in actor was bitten by a venomous snake on set, sending production into chaos. The shoot was delayed for weeks, and the company lost thousands. Hogan was shaken. He developed a lifelong fear of snakes and refused to work near them again. From that day on, his contracts included a clause banning snakes from set. It was a strange superstition, but one he never broke. Then came 1972, the year that almost destroyed him. Hogan poured everything he had, including $10,000 of his own savings, into a TV pilot called The Little Hogan Family. It was supposed to show a softer, suburban side of him, the dad, the everyman. He believed it would make him Australia's answer to the American sitcom kings. Instead, audiences hated it. Critics tore it apart, and the pilot was canceled after one episode. The ratings were disastrous. The dream felt over. Broke and embarrassed, Hogan nearly quit show business altogether. For a moment, it looked like he'd have to return to rigging on the bridge. Back to the danger, the noise, the sweat. But fate wasn't done with him. In 1973, Channel 9 offered him one more shot. A small sketch comedy show simply called The Paul Hogan Show. It was meant to fill 6 episodes, nothing more. Nobody expected it to work. But when it aired on July 20th, something magic happened. The audience couldn't stop laughing. Hogan's humor wasn't polished or scripted. It was raw, cheeky, and real. He made fun of politicians, cops, tourists, everyone. His boots were dirty, his sleeves cut short, and his grin wide. He wasn't a star pretending to be Australian. He was Australia. The ratings exploded. Within weeks, the show was pulling in 2.5 million viewers every Friday night. By 1974, Paul Hogan was one of the most famous faces in the country. He wasn't just a comedian, he was a symbol. The working-class hero who'd climbed from the steel beams to the TV screen. Australia had never had a celebrity like him before, and yet, even in success, Hogan stayed humble. He wrote his own sketches, often on the back of napkins or lunch bags. He'd show up early, help set up lights, and chat with the audience before filming. People felt like they knew him, like he was one of them. And that was exactly why his fame grew so fast. But fame, as he'd soon learn, doesn't stay kind forever. Behind the laughter, trouble was brewing. 3 writers on his show were caught stealing Hogan's jokes and selling them to rival programs. When he found out, he exploded, storming into a production meeting and firing all 3 on the spot. Scripts flew. Voices rose. The show shut down for 2 weeks while the network scrambled to calm things down. From that point on, Hogan decided he'd write almost everything himself. He'd built his career from nothing, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. What came next would take him beyond Australia, beyond comedy, and into Hollywood itself. Because one night, while sitting with his best friend and co-star John Cornell, the 2 men came up with an idea that would change both their lives forever. A story about a rugged bushman from the outback who ends up in New York City. A character who was fearless, funny, and utterly unfiltered. His name was Mick Dundee. By the early 2000s, Paul Hogan's life seemed like a strange reflection of the characters he'd once played. A charming rogue fighting against forces bigger than himself. Only this time, there were no cameras rolling and no happy ending waiting in the script. The man who had once symbolized the spirit of adventure and Aussie resilience was suddenly at war with his own government. It started when the Australian Taxation Office accused him and his longtime business partner, John Cornell, of hiding millions in offshore accounts. The headlines were brutal. Hogan's millions missing. Crocodile Dundee star in tax haven scandal. For the first time, his image as a national hero cracked. Paul insisted it was all nonsense, that the government was trying to make an example out of him. "I've paid more tax than most of those blokes chasing me," he famously said. But it didn't matter. The fight dragged on for years, with endless legal fees, travel bans, and sleepless nights. When he tried to fly back to Australia in 2010 to attend his mother's funeral, he was shocked at the airport. Officials informed him that he was barred from leaving the country until he settled his case. He was essentially trapped. For a man who had built his entire career on freedom and exploration, being confined was pure torture. "I miss saying goodbye to my mum," he later said quietly. "That one still hurts." Eventually, the tax case was dropped due to lack of evidence. The government never found the fortune they accused him of hiding. But the damage was already done. The stress had taken its toll. By the time he was cleared, Paul was no longer the grinning bushman the world remembered. His hair was thinner, his smile more restrained, his shoulders heavy. The aftermath left him questioning everything: fame, loyalty, and the true price of success. The public had turned its back on him during his worst years, and Hollywood had moved on long before that. In a rare interview, he admitted that money had become a curse. "When you don't have it, you dream about it," he said. "When you do, it eats you alive." Those who knew him best described a man torn between bitterness and acceptance. He'd walk along Malibu's quiet beaches alone, staring out at the waves. Neighbors often saw him at dawn, barefoot in the sand, his face distant. The once brash comedian had grown introspective, almost haunted. Around that time, he began opening up about his declining health. He confessed that he was struggling to maintain his weight and that his muscles had wasted away. "I've got 0 body fat," he said in a 2022 interview, his voice cracking. "I'm just weak. I can't put the weight back on." His frailty shocked fans who still pictured him as the rugged outback hero with the confident grin. The man who once wrestled crocodiles on screen now struggled to open a jar of peanut butter. Yet, despite his vulnerability, he faced it with the same dry humor that had carried him through everything. When asked how he felt about getting old, he smirked. Well, it's better than the alternative. Through it all, one person remained by his side, his wife and former co-star, Linda Kozlowski. After their whirlwind romance on the Crocodile Dundee set, they'd built a quiet life in Los Angeles. Though they eventually divorced in 2014, Linda never spoke ill of him. She said he was a man who cared too much, worked too hard, and couldn't rest. Even after their split, they stayed in touch, bonded by years of shared fame and isolation. Paul admitted he still missed her. "She was my best mate for a long time," he said softly. "You don't just lose that." These days, Hogan lives quietly in California, far from the lights of Hollywood. His sprawling Malibu home, once filled with laughter, has become more of a retreat, a place where he can hide from the noise. Friends say he spends his days reading, watching old comedies, and reflecting on his life. He occasionally steps out to meet a few Aussie expats, but his days of parties and interviews are long gone. "I'm done chasing anything," he told a journalist. "I had my run. It was a bloody good one." Still, there's a melancholy that hangs over his words. Fame had given him everything, and taken almost as much. When asked about his legacy, Paul doesn't talk about awards or money. Instead, he smiles faintly and mentions laughter. "If someone can watch Crocodile Dundee 30 years from now and still laugh," he says, "then I did something right." And that's true. For millions around the world, Paul Hogan wasn't just an actor. He was a symbol of a time when comedy was fearless, when people believed in underdogs and honest charm. He brought Australia to the global stage and gave the world a new kind of hero, one with a wide smile and a knife that was no knife. Yet, behind the humor and the fame lies a deeper truth about Paul Hogan's story, one that speaks to the fragility of success. The same world that built him up tore him down when he stumbled. He wasn't perfect, and he never pretended to be. His life has been a roller coaster of triumph, scandal, and heartbreak. But perhaps that's what makes his journey so human. Like the rugged bushman he portrayed, Hogan has endured storms that would have broken lesser men. He lost friends, fortune, and fame, but he never lost his wit or his will to keep going. In one of his last public appearances, when asked what advice he'd give to young actors chasing fame, Hogan chuckled and said, "Don't take yourself too seriously. The world will do that for you." It was classic Paul, equal parts wisdom and humor wrapped in a grin that had weathered decades. Behind that line, though, was the quiet wisdom of a man who had seen both the best and worst of life in the spotlight. And so, today, when fans remember Paul Hogan, they don't just remember the crocodile wrestling adventurer. They remember a man who came from nothing, made the world laugh, and somehow survived the crushing weight of his own success. The boy from Lightning Ridge became an icon, a millionaire, a target, and, finally, a survivor. His story is a reminder that fame fades, money disappears, but character, the kind built in the dust and danger of the outback, endures, even. As age and illness have slowed him down, Hogan hasn't lost his humor. When an interviewer recently asked if he'd consider making one last film, he smiled and said, "Sure, as long as I don't have to wrestle anything." There's a twinkle in his eye that suggests that deep down, he's still that scrappy, fearless Aussie who could charm the world with a joke and a wink. The body may have weakened, but the spirit, it's still there, stubborn, resilient, and unmistakably Paul Hogan. And maybe that's the real story, not the millions he made or lost, not the scandals or the headlines, but the simple fact that he endured. Beneath the fame and fortune, beneath the rugged movie star image, there's a man who loved deeply, laughed loudly, and lived fully. He may no longer be the Hollywood star the world once idolized, but he remains something far greater, a symbol of endurance, humility, and the bittersweet cost of chasing dreams. So, as the sun sets over Malibu and the ocean glows gold against the horizon, Paul Hogan, the man who once captured the world's heart, sits quietly on his porch, the sea breeze brushing against his weathered face. There's no spotlight, no applause, no fame left to chase. Just peace. And perhaps after everything he's been through, that's the one thing he's truly earned. Because for Paul Hogan, life has come full circle. From the blazing red dust of the Australian outback to the tranquil blue of the Pacific Ocean. He's not the indestructible hero anymore, he's something rarer. He's real,